Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in our series on the international student life cycle, starting with international student recruitment and their needs prior to arriving at their institution, then moving on to their retention and success while studying at the institution, and then lastly, their success in integration into the workforce following their graduation. NEBI is delighted to co-host this series with the Global Alliance for International Student Advancement, or GISA, the New England Council, and the New Hampshire College and University Council. Today, in our first webinar in the series, we will explore the first part of the international student life cycle. We'll take a deep dive into the recruitment piece. And we'll start by reviewing the ever-changing federal policy landscape as it pertains to international student recruitment. And we'll share strategies for boosting New England's international student recruitment and enrollment, particularly in a post-COVID world. Please feel free to ask questions at any time in the Q&A box. My NEBI colleague Stafford will be monitoring the box, and he will chime in to ask your questions throughout the discussion. We'll also leave some time at the end dedicated for audience questions. I am Stephanie Murphy. I'm the Associate Director of Policy at NEBI, and I will be moderating today's session. And I thank you all for joining us today. Today's meeting is on the record, and the video will be shared with registrants afterward, along with any materials or resources that we bring up throughout the course of our conversation. We're absolutely thrilled to have our esteemed panelists with us today. We've got Sarah Spreitzer, who serves as the Director of Government Relations at the American Council on Education. In this role, Sarah represents ACE and its members on matters related to research, policy and funding, federal policy, international students, immigration, and legislative issues. We have Dr. Margie Ensign, who's the 29th president of Dickinson College and a member of the GISA Advisory Council. And her bio and list of accomplishments are far too extensive to cover. It would take the full hour to go through everything, so I'll just have to hit on a few of the highlights. Dickinson is recognized as a leading institution in global education and was the first college to receive the Senator Paul Simon Award for Comprehensive Internationalization twice. President Ensign is a well-respected scholar on development, Africa, and through her experiences in Rwanda on genocide as well. She is presented at the World Economic Forum. She's been interviewed multiple times by the BBC and CNN. She's written for the Washington Post, and she's testified before Congress on global education, international affairs, and foreign assistance. Then we have Istiar Chowdhury, who's the Senior Associate Director of International Admissions at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. In this role, he helps guide all international recruitment efforts and strategy for the college. And last but not least, we have Kushal Safi, who is an International Safety Officer at Northeastern University, where he's responsible for the assessment and oversight of travel risk, safety, security, health preparedness, and appropriate intervention for international students at Northeastern. Panelists, thank you so much for being with us here today. Sarah, I want to start off with a question for you. I want to start off by asking you about the ever-changing federal policy landscape with regard to international students. There were a number of federal policy changes that happened during the Trump administration, and we're already starting to see a reversal of some of these policies under the Biden administration, but there are still a lot of moving parts. There's a lot going on. What can you tell us about where we are and where we might be going at the federal level?
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I love any and all excuses to talk about international students and the immigration landscape, so very happy to be here today. I thought we would start with kind of where we've been under the Trump administration. It's interesting that you said that there were a number of policy changes. By one count, there were actually over 400 policy and regulation changes related to immigration. So, not all of those policy and regulations were directly focused on international students, but obviously our international students were caught up in many of those. And so, a few of the biggest included the travel ban. Folks may remember very exciting evening in January when the first travel ban came out, and it caused massive chaos for our international students around the world. In the end, several of the travel bans were overturned by the courts. Travel ban 3.0 was the one that was in existence. It impacted a small number of countries, and in some cases there were waivers for students. But really, the damage was done by the chilling impact it had on prospective international students. And I would just say on his very first day in office, President Biden overturned that travel ban. Second big issue I would bring up is just the overall slowdown on visa processing. This came about due to many, many requests for evidence, an increase in denials. For optional and practical training, we saw processing times jump up from 90 days to over 5 months, which created a lot of uncertainty for our students and at times really limited them in their opportunities. And then finally, at the end of the administration, we saw a proposed rule around duration of status. This would have established a fixed duration of admission for our international students, either at a 2-year or a 4-year period, which would have been very problematic because we know many students take more than 4 years to complete a bachelor's, or they sometimes transfer into a 4+1 program to get their master's degree. And this would have caused a lot of confusion. Some of these are very easy to unwind. I mentioned that the travel ban had already been overturned. The slowdown in visa processing is taking a little while for the Biden administration to ramp up around. The duration of status proposed rule, unfortunately, is still out there. It was in the process of receiving comments. The comments were closed. It was never actually finalized, but we are waiting for DHS to formally withdraw that proposed rule. President Biden now has a Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and a Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, in place. But we are still waiting for the appointment and the confirmation of many of the deputy assistant secretaries under the 2 secretaries. Once the secretaries were confirmed, the American Council on Education and the higher education community has asked them to take some steps to specifically help our international students. This includes asking that they carry out the timely and efficient processing of visas and authorizations and prioritize student visas, especially for our upcoming fall semester. We've also asked for them to restore the 2015 Rice Cable, which allows consular affairs officers the ability to waive some requirements around immigrant intent. We've asked them to officially withdraw the proposed rules around duration of status, and a message that optional practical training will stay in place. We've also asked DHS to restore the Homeland Security Academic Advisory Council, which allowed the higher education community to have regular conversations with DHS officials. We've also asked that Customs and Border Protection be instructed to follow DHS and state guidance for entering students because of some of the issues that we saw under the Trump administration. And finally, we are asking the Biden administration to send a welcoming message to our international students at the highest level of government. Folks are probably aware that President Biden is working with Congress on comprehensive immigration legislation. This legislation was unveiled back in February, very soon after President Biden took office. It has been introduced in the House and the Senate. It's a very large bill, over 400 pages, but there are some provisions that would specifically impact our international students. That includes creating a new green card program that would create a path for citizenship for PhD STEM graduates from US institutions of higher education. It would also allow for dual intent for international students. It would allow for an extension for F1 visa holders if they have applied for an additional program or an additional visa. This is a great message to send to our international students that this administration is trying to find ways to improve the experience for our international students. But unfortunately, this legislation is not expected to move anytime soon. There are also many provisions in the legislation that impact our Dreamers and our DACA students, which are also a priority for our community. It looks more likely like pieces of the bill will be broken off and tried to move independently. Because of some of the issues going on at the border, there's not a lot of bipartisan support to pass comprehensive immigration reform. I'd also like to mention that one of the biggest issues that Congress is dealing with right now is issues surrounding China. And higher education is caught up in many of these conversations, especially around the issues of foreign influence. Last week, we saw the Senate Foreign Relations Committee mark up a bill called the Strategic Competition Act of 2021. The bill has a lot to do with economic security, diplomacy provisions, but it also includes Section 138, which ties foreign gift and contract reporting to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, otherwise known as CFIUS. CFIUS was set up to look at very large business transactions between US companies and foreign investors. It was never set up to examine transactions between nonprofits and, say, alumni giving. So this is a really problematic provision for us. It was included in the bill after the markup, and so we expect to see it on the floor when the Senate takes up that legislation. There are also a few other bills being considered for part of a larger China package, including a bill that was introduced last year by Senator Portman called the Safeguarding American Innovation Act. And this bill has a provision, it's under Section 5, that would greatly expand the ability of the Secretary of State to deny visas for national security concerns. We're very concerned about this expansion of authority, especially given the fact that the Secretary of State already has the authority to deny visas based on national security concerns, and the presidential proclamation, which remains in place, which allows the Secretary of State the ability to deny a visa or, in fact, revoke a visa for a graduate student that may have ties to a Chinese institution of higher education with an affiliation with the Chinese military. So that's something that we continue to very closely monitor. Beyond international students, I think institutions of higher education are very caught up in the conversation around foreign gifts and contracts. And again, this is something that bipartisan members of Congress are very clear in messaging that this isn't meant to impact every international student that they receive, that they are very focused on kind of bad actors in the systems. But given the last 4 years of the Trump administration, we're worried about the message that this is sending to our students. So what does the fall look like for our international students? And I know many of our speakers are going to speak to the impacts on their campus, but at ACE and with the rest of the higher education community, we are working to message to state and DHS the importance of trying to start processing student visas for the fall, so that if our campuses are open, we can welcome our international students. And then finally, we're also watching very closely how the Biden administration will unwind some of the actions taken by the Trump administration, especially around delays in visa processing. In my last conversation that I had with the State Department, they talked about a backlog. Even if they are able to get the consulates back up and running, they estimate that they have about a 4-month backlog, with the issues that they were facing even pre-COVID. So Stephanie, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I'm really interested to hear what the other panelists have to say from a campus perspective.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a lot of information. It was very helpful. I'm going to have to rewatch the recording of the webinar just to absorb all of that. Thank you so much for that very thorough overview. Yes.
We had one question of Sarah, and is, Sarah, what did you mean by dual intent?
Sure. Thanks, Stafford. So currently with student visas, a student has to convince a consular officer that they don't have the intent to eventually emigrate to the United States. So they can't say, you know, I hope to come to study to the US to get my PhD and eventually work for a US company. And so if students were allowed for dual intent, we just believe that it would be a better message to send to our international students. It would also just make it a little easier for the processing of the visas.
Thank you.
President Ensign, I now want to turn it over to you really quickly. Sarah reviewed some of the recommendations that ACE has for what they want to see done at the federal level. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, given the importance of international students to American higher education, what sort of programs or policies would you like to see developed at the federal level?
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for inviting me to be on this. Sarah, that was one of the most thoughtful and comprehensive analysis of where we are that I've heard. So I thank you. And I thank ACE for all the work you've been doing, you know, carrying the torch for us. But I think we should also listen to, you know, Sarah was very, very thoughtful, saying we need to repeal, we need to withdraw. That's where we are in America right now. And I think we need to get to the point of talking about, what are we going to create? What new things are we going to create for international students so that they want to come here again? Because I think we have multiple challenges. One, for a number of years, we've very clearly sent the message that you're not welcome. We consider you a threat. We're worried about having you here. I mean, go back, all of you on this call are the experts in global education. Go back and look at the last NAFSA report before we went into COVID, and the top reasons for declining international student enrollment were visa delays, the social and political environment in the US, feeling unwelcome. I mean, that data is so important, and I fear for what the data that will come out in 21. So I honestly think we should put our heads together as leaders of global ed in the United States. And in addition to supporting all the work that Sarah and ACE is doing to make sure that we undo the damage, we begin creating programs that say, we want you here. And one that goes way back, and I don't even know if it's still running. You know, we think of State Department and HHS. What about USAID? Years ago, they ran programs called participant training, where they literally brought millions of young people to America to study here, to learn about America, to learn about our democratic system, honestly. And when they went back home, then they carried some of what they learned. Some of those people went on to be leaders of their countries. I would love to have an effort where all of us collectively say, let's create new programs. Let's message better that we want students here. And then let's really focus as a group on new programs that we can build together to send that message, because the world demands it. The world that this next generation will take over has to have understanding of international issues and has to have had the opportunity to work with young people from around the world. So thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for you, President Ensign. Taking it from the federal level and now drilling down to the institution level. I know that Dickinson College has had a long history of successfully recruiting and supporting international students. And between 2013 and 2018, you essentially doubled your international student population. So what would you say has been the key to this success in the past, and how is the global landscape for student recruitment changing?
Well, you know, thank you for that. Global is in Dickinson's DNA. You know, for 50 years, we've said an undergraduate education is incomplete if American students don't leave the US. I'm so proud of our study abroad numbers. You know, the average is about 15% on most campuses. We're 68%. So from the time American students walk in the door, we say, we expect this of you. It doesn't matter if you're studying science, we have a program for you. It doesn't matter if you're an athlete, your coaches will work with you. So we've had that perspective for a very long time. We also have 13 centers of our own around the world. And our students don't have to go to those centers, but those individuals in our centers who are Dickinson employees help with recruitment. Our head of international recruitment has been with us for 20 years. He knows everyone. So he's out, doing important work. But I have to say, we should learn the lessons from COVID, and there's some that we need to keep. One was, in some ways, we leveled the playing field, didn't we, with Zoom? Because young people could call in from all over. I was on a call last week with a young man from Nepal, and he was whispering. And I said, why are you whispering? He said, it's 4 o'clock here. I don't want to wake my family up. And I thought, this is wonderful. This is an opportunity to reach young people we may never have done before. And of course, we recorded all of those and sent them out. So I'm not saying it's been an easy year, but perhaps we've increased access this year to those kinds of sessions. I mean, our staff did programs morning, noon, and night. We put new content, as I'm sure all of our participants on this webinar did, new things on our website that explained us better, and new videos for young people who couldn't come to campus. So I think we learned a lot through this pandemic. Our numbers are really good looking towards the fall. We went into some markets like Vietnam before others and have built great capacity there, and in South Korea. And of course, our alums, those students who come here and graduate, they go home and they're also our ambassadors. So there's a variety of things I think that have helped us.
Great, thank you so much. Now, Isthir and Chowdhury, I want to turn it over to you guys. I have a grouping of questions, and I want to let you guys each have your turn to answer that grouping of questions. So, if you could tell us a bit about your role on campus as admissions officers and international safety officers. What is your role in the international recruitment process? How do your roles intersect on campus? How have your roles changed over the past few years, especially in light of the changing federal policy and global landscapes? So, Isthir, do you maybe want to take that first?
Sure, I'll jump right into it. In terms of our role on campus, or my role in particular, I'm at the front end of the experience for students. So engaging them, educating them about Trinity, college education in the US, taking in their applications, counseling them as they explore their options of college in the US, and ultimately enrolling those students and handing them off. Mostly, I stay involved throughout the 4 years as well, but getting them in the door so they can get here, right? Get here and get an education. And in terms of the intersection of our roles, Safi will speak more to this. That includes counseling students who have concerns about coming to the US, whether it's safety-wise, whether it's having to go through administrative review or processing, right, when they apply for a visa. So being able to answer these questions, being able to tap into resources across campus to alleviate the anxiety that some of these students have, help them understand what the process is going to be, and also be realistic with them about, the possibility that they might not be able to make it to the US in some cases. And when we look at how my role has changed in the past 3 years, I think about 3 big ways that it's transformed. The first is really mechanical, process-wise. Our recruitment timeline has transformed. We used to have a traditional fall recruitment season, spring sort of recruitment plus yield season as we were looking at admitted students and trying to bring them to campus, starting to talk to 11th graders and younger. But with Zoom, it's year round. We aren't able to travel as much as we've been able to, so we've lost that component. But at the same time, while we've opened up access, we've also allowed a full calendar to be opened up to recruitment engagement with schools and students. And that has shifted work schedules. We've had to be creative in the office about realizing people have to be up at 6 in the morning, recruiting from 6 to 9 a.m. and then maybe 5 to 10 p.m. on some days, and adjusting to that. Another big way is really before COVID, even we began being more and more deputized to represent not just our institution, but the US. As COVID has brought the true customer experience to light, students have examined their options in the UK, Canada, Australia, Europe, a lot of other Western countries, even Asia, right? Singapore, universities in Japan, Korea are starting to compete more and more for our students as they find the US less appealing, maybe for a variety of reasons. Many of the issues we've already talked about here, combined with the cost, combined with the uncertainty of even being able to make it to the US with the current travel bans. So we are truly now competing in a global landscape, whereas 4 or 5 years ago, you really could have pretty safely gone and just represented your institution among other US institutions, because we as a group were being held up by the prestige and reputation of US colleges and our education. So being a little more aware of that competition. And then the third big way, sort of being stuck on the ground here, is good in another way. I've been on campus more than I ever have. I've been in admissions for 8 years now. And usually when students are here, I'm not here. We're out on the road, recruiting prospective students, talking to families, doing our work. And then when we're here, the students are not here. They're gone on winter break, they're gone on their summer vacation. So being here while students are here and also interfacing with a lot of student services, I mentioned the customer service experience is just becoming more and more important, right? As students consider their options. And I'm delivering my expertise and my experience and funneling those questions and concerns from the front end to our student services, to leadership, right? Making sure we emerge from the pandemic in a much more competitive position, creating an experience where all stakeholders have an understanding of international needs, and we have dedicated staff supporting international students where needed.
Great, thank you. Safi.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. And yes, absolutely agree with everything Esther has to say. I had a little bit of a speech written up, and I think I will though address the the safety concern at the end of that too. So let me tell you a little bit about my my role at the university. As it is a bit unique. There are about 150 institutions in the U.S. that have somebody like me. But ultimately, not every institution has an international safety person, and really, my role has morphed a bit from from its inception in 2014. So Northeastern asked me to come in. I had just separated from the U.S. intelligence community in summer of 2014. My home was New England, right? So I came back home into the New England area. And my wife was really happy about it because she really didn't want me to travel back to the Middle East or South Asia, as I was doing so extremely often, right? I would be in the U.S. for maybe 4 or 5 months, and then I'd be out in the field for the 6 or 7 months that I had to do the run operations and do work. But going to higher education, I assumed that it was going to be a little easier than the world that I had come from, but clearly different set of challenges. That I wasn't really accustomed to, but really excited because I got to build a program from the ground up. So basically, what do I do, right? So in my role, I set up a safety plans for travelers going abroad and for international students coming back to the States. I'm housed within public safety. I report to Office of General Counsel, and I report to the head of the public safety office. My day-to-day role, I get to manage 3 amazing analysts that are constantly watching the world. And we have a student co-op who also is working in our office. And as an aside, our last student co-op was offered or awarded a Fulbright scholarship and was assigned to the US Embassy in Brussels. So I think, part of my mentorship is in that, connecting students with, embassies and connecting students with my old institutions in the Intel community. But what we're charged with in the International Safety Office is preparing our global program participants to manage the risk around the world. We also monitor global events and what is their impact to our campuses or our campus or our program footprints, right? So our program footprints are pretty much everywhere in the world. We have faculty members operating in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have students operating throughout Europe, and this has continued on during the pandemic. We also offer faculty and staff and students assistance when things happen, so that ultimately we manage their health and safety while they're abroad. And I also co-chair the university's risk committee. So what I do in that capacity is I'm the one that's putting up, these are the high risk countries, or these aren't the high risk countries, and the process is where you have to petition. So in this role, my intersection with international admissions and enrollment has mostly been, supporting faculty and staff when they go abroad for admissions purposes, monitoring the globe and geopolitical events that might impact recruiting and yield, and then preparing international students for life on campus. So we do presentations for parents and students on how to avoid scams, how to work with the police in the States, and then ultimately with the goal of opening up a discussion between security representatives and international student groups, in the hopes of really improving our relationships with international students or visiting scholars, and breaking down those barriers. But also part of my role traditionally has been to build liaison relationships with the CBP, with FBI, U.S. intelligence community, and similar organizations in the UK and Canada, as we have campuses in both countries. And these relationships, ultimately have helped our visiting faculty and international students manage entry processes and issues that might come up during the visa process, which has helped us stay ahead of the COVID needs. So really what has changed during COVID, one of the last questions. Since COVID, the university has asked me to take on a ton of additional tasks that include monitoring the US for where hotspots come up and help assisting students in those areas identify healthcare. We've also had monitoring travel around the world, because we've still had global programs operating during the pandemic. So we haven't stopped in any of our programs. So we've had to do a little bit more heavy lifting vis-a-vis entry, exit requirements, COVID testing requirements, and really just setting up COVID testing for international students that are trying to come to the States. If they don't have their own testing, we're offering private testing through some of our vendors. We're also identifying which U.S. embassies are operational. I know that both Margie and Sarah talked about the issues with visas and travel bans. And right now, we see a ton of students asking us, especially Chinese students, how can I get a visa because my embassy is closed, or Indian students saying the same thing, is there a way for me to get out? And ultimately, we have to work on a case-by-case basis with those, with the faculty, the students, and the staff to identify areas where they can go, and identify embassies that are operational. And then thirdly, identify the embassies which are allowing third country nationals to apply for non-immigrant visas, which is actually very difficult, because if you notice, some embassies that are open, they're only allowing nationals of that country or residents of that country to apply for a visa there. We also build plans for student travel if they're trying to attempt study in person at our campuses, and we've leveraged those liaison relationships that I talked about earlier to navigate these dynamic entry processes where we have campuses. So we were able to still get students into Canada when there were some issues about will Canadian campuses be open, and what then is the need for those students to show, or really faculty and staff. Also, are they carrying the appropriate documents to say that the university is open and accepting people in person? Do they have the right testing? Do they have the right processing here? And we've even set up pathways so that these students, faculty, and staff can submit those documents to the local immigration or border services, so that they can get pre-clearance, or at least they can get an understanding of whether or not they have the appropriate documents for entry. And I think there was also, Istahir talked about the is America safe? That's something that we in a public safety role continue to struggle with, right? Because there's a lot of demystifying the the situation here in the States. And what we did back in February 2017, if you remember, there were 3 Indian students that were shot in a Kansas sports bar. One Indian student died. The other 2 were injured, but survived the attack. That was the beginning of a lot of turmoil really in higher ed and in public safety of are we doing enough to prepare our students, not just domestic students, but other students, international students that may be mistaken or for Iranians or Arabs or things like that, and then there would be racially motivated attacks against these groups, right? And that's really what happened here in the Kansas City sports bar attack. And then we also had that, on top of that, prospective students and their families were like, hey, America just isn't safe. So we had to really sit down with our international admissions folks, and we created a bunch of talking points for our admissions folks to discuss, here's what safety looks like on campus. Here's how New England really is different from the rest of the United States, and what the gun culture is in the United States isn't the same as you get in the New England or even in like the East Coast really. And then we ultimately made my office, so the 4 of us, available to our admission staff, so that when parents called in, we would then be able to speak to those parents and talk to them on a one-to-one level. And we got a lot of calls, and those talking points we've updated regularly for each 6-month period in the the stats on what's happening in the Boston area, safety on campus, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that to me is a big takeaway of how international admissions and international student offices and their relationship with their public safety component can really build these these networks and respond to the needs of families if they're thinking about coming to the States, or even if they need assistance in other ways of traveling back and forth.
So, Safi, I have 2 quick questions from our audience. I think the first is, have you seen a delay in processing of student visas? I think that's the first question. And the second question is, has your role expanded at Northeastern to include student safety, including, I think the example here is anti-Asian issues?
Yeah. So I'll tackle the second one first, and then I think the first question, I can address that, but I think some of our other panelists might have some good insight into that too. So the second question is, yes, my role has expanded. We've constantly looked at issues that are targeting our international groups, especially our groups from the Middle East. We have a large contingent of students from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, from Iran, Jordan. We do a lot of work with the UAE, so we have folks moving back and forth between those areas. Our goal really is to get in front of those student groups and to hear their concerns, but prepare them for any type of incidents that might happen, and then ultimately keep those pathways open or those communication nodes open, so that if they feel that there's any issues, that they can call us. And what I tell people right off the bat, nothing you tell me will be put in front of a board, or nothing you tell me will get to that point where you're going to be in trouble for telling me something. So what I can do is I can receive anonymous information, and I can handle case-by-case concerns with students or with anybody else they want to bring to our attention. Or I can provide the person who's out calling with advice, and then give that person my contact information to pass along, or that person could act as a liaison between the person who needs assistance and my office. At no point do we want to, become intrusive and take over those other folks, role or hopefully destroy that relationship, right? So that's really our goal. And we started with Arabic students or the students coming from the Middle East. Then we moved to Venezuelan students because there was a big issue with the issue in Venezuela and how they would be treated here, and ultimately their visa needs and passport needs. So we were able to work with U.S. government, citizen services, things like that to keep them in status. Then we moved from there to a lot of the Indian students' needs or South Asian students. Now we've moved to, Asian and Pacific Islanders because of the uptick in violence, and because we have a very large, Chinese, Taiwanese, and Southeast Asian population on our campus. Now, the second question, which is really the first question, is do we see a delay? Yes, we absolutely do see a delay, and some of that delay in visa processing is because of the administrative processing that students in China are receiving, because of also the closures of those embassies. So we're seeing two bits, right? Students can't get visa appointments in their country, so they're requesting emergency appointments, which delays the process. Once they get a visa appointment, then they have to go through what's called administrative processing, most often than not. And that involves name traces in the US intelligence community to verify whether they're telling the truth of who they are, which takes additional time. So we're going to see a ton of backlogs, especially with Chinese students, Iranian students, and other prescribed entities that, like Russia, for example, Turkey, we're starting to see a bit of an uptick on processing, things like that. But I'll open it up to some of the other folks that, might have a better insight into the legislation around that. But yes, I was even on the phone today with our CBP counterparts talking about an Iranian student who applied in Pakistan. And we found out that, the student had accomplished everything they needed to do, but they're still in administrative processing because the Pakistan issue of travel bans from other countries. So it's just compounding these matters. The COVID situation is just compounding the matters of what we're seeing.
Well, Sophie, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and maybe President Ensign or Istiar about whether or not what you've seen or heard.
Thanks, Stafford. I mean, this is one of the biggest issues that we're working on right now, because we know that April and May are hugely essential to our international students, especially for the fall. So we sent a letter to state and DHS recently that asked for a few things, including that they try and prioritize student visas once the consulates are back up and open. The issue is that for student visas, there's a requirement of an in-person interview, and that has to be performed at the consulate. And so if the consulate is closed, there's no one to give the in-person interview. And so, as Safi was saying, the biggest issue is China and India. If they're unable to open the consulates, we've asked for flexibility, perhaps looking at virtual interviews. Unfortunately, the State Department has said that they cannot do that because of security concerns. We have also asked DHS to look at the guidance that's currently in place for our international students. In non-COVID times, international students are only allowed to take one course online. So right now we have flexible guidance that has been issued by DHS that says you can take up to a full program of study online during the time of the pandemic. What we're concerned with now is if all of our campuses reopen in the fall, but our international students are still not here, that ICE could withdraw the guidance thinking that the crisis has passed. And so we are trying to communicate to DHS that we continue to need that flexibility. And then finally, we're looking at the travel restrictions, which I think is something that's being discussed at the highest levels within the White House, because it's not just our international students, it's also business travelers, people looking at their summer vacations. And I think that there's a lot of conversations going on country to country. And so we've seen that although there are travel restrictions between the US and Europe, there was an exemption provided for students. Now that exemption is there because Europe also exempts US students traveling to Europe. And so it's harder because China has not allowed that exemption for our students traveling from the US to China. So far there's no exemption for Chinese students traveling to the US. And that travel restriction says that basically you can't travel to the US if you've been in one of those countries 14 days beforehand. So there's ways to get around it. You can travel through another country, but obviously that's expensive and burdensome for the student. And so we continue to have those conversations, especially with the State Department, and they have assured us that they are working as hard as possible, but there's a lot of complicating factors.
I'll just make a brief comment about something Safi said related to safety, because of course that's just a huge issue for all of our students. We hear that constantly, gun violence and everything else. But as Safi said, we need to localize our discussions with prospective students, because every community is different, every region is different. So we've tried to make sure that our prospective students understand that, you know, Carlisle has a number of institutions that would welcome them, including the U.S. Army War College. We have a program with the international fellows that come from close to 100 countries around the world, come to Carlisle, and their host families for our international students. Even in the midst of COVID, these international fellows have partnered and mentored our students. So each of us in our communities have resources like that. And I think we need to consider that as we talk to students and make sure they understand the US is a very big place. And, you know, the college or university they're looking at is in a, you know, specific community. So I would just suggest that we each localize that discussion when we're talking to international students. But it's very clear health and safety are paramount issues right now for international students.
Stafford, do we have any questions lined up in the
Well,
Q&A, or do I have?
we have this is a question, and it's a projection, I think. This one's for Sarah, and I'm also going to ask if Debbie Scary, who has raised her hand, if she could just type her question into the Q&A so we can respond to it. So this is from Isaac. Sarah, we're acting conservatively in recommending international students take at least 50% of the coursework on the ground and hybrid. Looks like his question got cut off. Do we know if
Oh, it's at the end. Do we know if that will change?
Yes.
You mentioned that the special dispensation for international students to take more online coursework is continuing. More details, if available, would be most welcome.
Sure. So the guidance we have right now is from March 2020 that DHS allowed to go forward. Again, it allows international students to remain in the US, even if their program of study has gone completely online. You know, under the requirements of a student visa, you can only take one course online. And so we're hoping that DHS will continue that flexibility, even if our campuses are able to reopen, because we know it will be problematic for our students outside the US to enter. You know, what we've heard back from state and DHS is that they are hoping that our institutions will remain flexible. They do not want to message at all that international students will not be able to get here until 2022. For example, that's what has been messaged by Australia and New Zealand. You know, they are going to try and get our students here. They just don't have a timeline. And so I think the concern is if they miss the start of the semester in September and they're able to travel in November, how will our institutions support those students? And they're very difficult questions. And I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you. You know, I think that the issues in China and India are going to be a little more difficult because their vaccination rates and their infection rates are higher. And so the consulates are likely not going to be opening at the same rate, say, that they may be reopening in Europe. And so we may see some disparities based on country, whether or not our international students can get here. And so I'm sorry, I don't have any other details, and that's not very probably helpful for fall planning.
Well, I think that's probably a question just about every institution is asking right now. And any insight you have about new students who are once again trying to navigate this whole process? Is there time, Sarah, at this point for a new student who is going to be going to, we'll say, Trinity? Is there time?
So again, Stafford, I think it depends on what country that student is coming from, and you know, unfortunately, how much resources they can put towards the problem. Because you know, with the travel restrictions and the consulates being closed, if they can get to a country where the consulates are open or that doesn't have the travel restrictions, it might be easier for them. But if they're coming from China or India and the consulates are going to remain closed until at least June, and we know that they're already working off of a backlog, it's likely going to be very difficult for them to get here in September. But that's not to say that they won't get here by November. And, you know, so it may not be a complete waste. And remember, once the consulates reopen, they're going to have to process our freshman classes who are unable to come. So they're going to be seeing, double the amount of visas that they're going to have to process. I would just add, Stafford, that's part of our ask that, the White House send a welcoming message to our international students. We are being patient. We understand that the State Department and DHS have a lot of other issues that they're working on and other visas that they're working on. But the more messaging that could be sent from leadership that they are working on the problem for our international students, I think will go a long way.
That makes infinite sense, Sarah, it really does. And I'm sure there are a lot of family members, especially in China and India, who are waiting word at this point. And quite frankly, in India, I'm not even sure if our embassies or consulates are operating on a full-time basis, especially with the pandemic. I haven't seen any more questions. Stephanie, maybe you could ask our audience if they have any more.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to pop those into the Q&A. And while we wait for some of those to come in, I have a follow-up question about an issue that's related to everything that we've been talking about around COVID, but that we haven't explicitly touched on. And that's the question of student vaccinations. It's a huge topic of discussion. In New England, we're trying to figure out, whether institutions can even mandate that students get vaccinated, questions around vaccinating out-of-state students, and then on top of that, throw in the question of what do we do with international students as well. So I'll throw this question out to all of you guys. What have you seen that institutions are doing in terms of this issue to address it? How are or should institutions police this issue? And are there any countries that have already developed some policies around vaccinating international students that we can look to model our own policies on? So I don't know who wants to take it first.
I'm happy to jump in. We've been discussing the health, the safety, the legal issues for some time. We'll have an announcement Friday to the entire campus community. So I don't want to jump ahead, but I'll just say, to get back to any sort of sense of being normal, we have to have everybody vaccinated, right? We have to. And my team and board has looked at the legal issues, and we require vaccinations for the flu. So we're looking at it in that way. For international students, and I know Safi has some interesting things to say about that, we're not going to require them to get a second vaccination because we don't know the interactions yet. So we have to, really look at that very carefully. But we've gone one step beyond, and I think it's very important because just as we worked so hard to protect our community when this started, and it was one of the reasons we were remote at the beginning, because we're a community with, I wouldn't say we're an older community, but we have a lot of older people here, and our hospital capacity isn't at the urban level. So we said to this whole community, and we put together a community action network of 92 public leaders. And we said, we're going to get through this together, and passed out thousands of masks and so on. The point is, we took a very broad perspective on community. It wasn't just Dickinson students, faculty, and staff. It was our Carlisle community. And we're doing the same now with the vaccination. And so I think we all need to do that, because our students don't just come to a campus. They don't just stay on campus. They're in a community. So I think all of us as academic leaders need to make sure that just as we worked hard to protect that community, now we have to encourage everyone. We have a new vaccine hesitancy program underway to make sure people really get this vaccination, because that's our way back to something that we used to know. So thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, I totally agreed. Yeah, what we're doing at Northeastern is we're going to require everybody to have a vaccine in the fall. And what that means is that if you're attending in person, no matter where you're coming from, you will be required to have a vaccine. We're not discriminating against which vaccine you have. So that was a discussion that we've just had. We want to make sure that students who are coming in from Russia or coming in from China, that if they have one of the non-FDA approved vaccines, that they'll still be able to participate in person, because we're saying, we're our global university. I think we have a bit more leeway because we're a private. And I think that, publics might have a little bit more difficulty with that, but we're taking it a step further now. We're saying that even if you don't have a vaccine before you arrive, because there's no vaccine requirement to travel into the US, we're going to help you get vaccinated, and we're going to have vaccination clinics on site. We are also requiring any student who's participating on a global program to also be vaccinated. And even this morning, we were having discussions about when can we start that requirement, and our president said start that today. So anybody who's participating in our programs starting in May will have a requirement to be vaccinated. So there's that. We're urging the vaccination thing, and we're really pushing it from all angles.
Esther, do you want to talk about what Trinity's doing, or?
Certainly. Our Board of Trustees meeting happened last week. So as President Ensign said, we may have an announcement coming soon. But as for right now, we're working to get as much of our community vaccinated as possible. In Connecticut, vaccination rates have been great. We're leading the country. So before we could even really effectively get a plan going on campus, timelines kept getting moved up. And so suddenly students are off campus getting vaccinated on their own before we actually had clinics in place. So we have a couple in place to ensure current students that are on campus. And most of our students actually are on campus. They've been on campus this spring and fall. So we're going to get them vaccinated before they're out for the summer. And then students that are returning, I expect we will have vaccinations available for them as well. And then taking into account the factors that I already mentioned, what if they have another vaccine that's not recognized yet, we're not going to be unreasonable about those, but official announcements yet to come.
All right, great. Stafford, I think we have time for one more audience question before we let our panelists have a final word.
I think Isaac has asked perhaps the final question, and I think it's a question about clarifying new versus international students regarding course requirements. And I think this is something you had mentioned, Sarah, earlier. And I think you've also mentioned there's additional ACE guidance that's been released on this. Do you want to clarify that?
Sure. So Stafford, I just sent Stephanie a note on the vaccine issue. We just put out a brief from our general counsel regarding vaccine requirements at colleges and universities. And so we'll make sure that we send that around. It does mention international students, but it doesn't go into much detail. And then I think that the other part of the question was related to the current Dhs Ice Guidance that we have for international students. That is for existing international students. And so basically the guidance that we have now is new international students are not allowed to come to the US if the program is completely online. That obviously will likely change as campuses are announcing that they're going to be reopening for the fall, or will be having more hybrid courses. And so if new international students are able to get their visas, they should be allowed to travel even if part of their programs are online due to COVID, as long as we can convince ICE to continue to allow us that flexibility.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to add on, not directly related, but first year students have been mentioned. And I think in terms of a recruitment perspective, those students are still in the recruitment pipeline. Students that have never set foot in the United States, set foot on campus. And we're already seeing attrition. A student, who has been taking online classes for the past year has decided to transfer to Australia. And so we have students that we are now working to truly retain. It's not just summer melts, but because they've never really been on campus, looking to build community somehow on the ground where those students are, so they can be part of the Dickinson community, the Trinity community, the Northeastern community. And I think that's been a big component that's been missing for these students. And they're going to have to be acclimated and oriented when they arrive on campus as well.
Just one very quick comment. Our Center for Global Study and Engagement worked tirelessly to create those communities in country for students who couldn't get in, with partner institutions and in lots of ways. And we all need to think that through in case this visa delay is worse than we think.
All right, great. We are coming up to the end of our time. We have covered so much ground, shared so much helpful information. I'm wondering if you all could take this opportunity to go around and leave us with some closing thoughts, quick closing thoughts on international student recruitment, possibly even ending us on an optimistic note. So maybe President Ensign, do you want to kick us off with the final word?
Sure. We all share a passion for international students and for study abroad, and we need to convey that to our policymakers. What this means to America, to national security issues. And so once we get beyond all the important things Sarah has talked about, I hope we stay together as a community and honestly begin lobbying now to create those new programs and to make sure each one of us sends that message. You are welcome here. We want you to be a part of our community. We will work with you to make sure you have the best experience ever. But we all need to do that on a very regular basis to move forward. Because I said at the beginning, all of the issues we face in the world are now international. I hope we learned that through the pandemic. And if we can all cooperate as we have as individuals and institutions and countries, we'll make that difference. So thanks for having me.
Safi, Asir, Sarah.
Yeah, I can't say it better than that. I mean, that's the kind of the perfect closing for me. We do, we welcome international students. We want our students to go have an international experience, whether they're coming from China to the UK or coming from the US to China. Our goal really is to meet our students' needs where they're at, right? And additionally to that, let them learn anywhere, anytime with anybody. And I think that's our real big goal, is to make sure these things get out there. And what we want to do is we also want to encourage the U.S. government to follow that role. We've moved away from the last administration, and I think now we're looking towards more positive administration. And I think the rhetoric has cooled a bit. And I think now we are really truly a more welcoming country. Hopefully that will translate into real action on the ground.
Yeah, I would just say I was so proud to be a part of this community over the last 4 years, and everything that we went through, that we continued to deliver that message to our international students, that our institutions welcome them and that we would defend them and protect them and support them, especially when confronted with COVID-19, when we all had to scramble to figure out how are we going to support our international students who don't have anywhere to go and are going to have to remain in the US during this crisis. And so I would just say I hope that that community continues, and I'm just excited about our work going into the future with a more friendly administration that can help us support our international students in a better way.
Sierra, the final word is yours.
Wow. Well, I always try to stay optimistic, and I get it, right? The winds of globalization and politics aren't always going to be in our favor, but you in a way won't recognize the good times without having struggled through and innovated through the difficult times. And I see this somewhat as a reset, right? We're going to re-enter a growth period again. Eventually, you're going to have the pandemics of life. You're going to have the 9/11s of life where we struggled through, but allow us to emphasize and illustrate the value of international education in new ways. And as we mentioned way earlier, the access that has come about because of virtual recruitment practices and the renewed focus that this will bring on the student experience as we compete with our other global institutions in other countries. So I'm excited to look forward, right, and continue collaborating despite of even the continued challenges we have, and really hope we can mentor new professionals to enter and stay in the field. That's been difficult, right, as our roles have all changed, but helping our younger staff, helping the people we mentor see the potential for change that they can implement and the work they can do as well.
All right, great. Well, that's a fantastic note for us to all end on. And I want to thank our panelists again so very, very much. It's been fantastic to have you all with us today, and we appreciate all that you're doing for your students, for international students, as well as your time and your expertise today. In the coming days, we will be circulating the video of this meeting as well as some of the resources that have been mentioned, including the one that Sarah mentioned on that ACE produced that has information about vaccine requirements. So keep an eye out for that to hit your inboxes. The second webinar in our 3-part series will be on international student retention and on-campus success, and it will take place 1 week from today on Monday, May 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. So if you have not already registered, we will include a link in our follow-up email, and you can sign up for that and continue the conversation with us next week. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you again to our audience for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again next week.